This is Dr. Barry, and in this video we'll discuss inland marine and ocean cargo from Assignment 8 of the CPCU text. Let's start with just a look at the history and an overview of inland marine insurance. Marine policies were first started to cover vessels and their cargoes, which is still the case internationally. So this is ocean going and any kind of ship or vessel that is going over water. In the early 1900s, U.S. rate and form regulation was very limiting in terms of the types of perils an insurer could cover. For example, they might only be able to write fire insurance, casualty insurance, or life insurance. But the trucking industry needed something broader. This was a new industry, and it encompassed a lot of different kinds of risks. So they turned to the inland marine policies. Inland marine policies were all risk policies, meaning that they were essentially open perils policies. They covered everything except that which was specifically excluded. So in the early 1900s, they began covering many trucking industry risks as well as other land-based risks. Inland marine coverages are frequently non-filed. I'll qualify that a little more in a moment. But notice that there is a nationwide marine definition, which is now really used just for classification purposes, but at one time was used for regulatory purposes. Take a look at this exhibit on page 8.5 of the text. It talks about imports, exports, domestic shipments, instrumentalities of transportation and communication such as bridges, tunnels, etc., various types of property owned or used by individuals such as jewelry, furs, musical instruments, etc., and various types of property pertaining to a business, profession, or occupation. Examples include mobile equipment, builders' risks, property in the custody of bailees, live animals, etc. So this encompasses most of the things that we're going to talk about today and the types of insurance that are used to cover those exposures. Let's first talk about filed classes, and then we'll look again at non-filed classes. Filed classes are those for which forms or rates must be filed with insurance regulators. Generally, this is a class of business that has a large number of insureds with similar loss exposures. ISO and AAIS file on behalf of their members. Of course, you remember ISO. AAIS is the American Association of Insurance Services and is very similar to ISO. The underwriter has less flexibility in modifying rates and forms of filed classes. Let's look at what filed classes are in inland marine. This is a list directly from your textbook, so it includes accounts receivable, camera and musical instrument dealers, film, floor plan merchandise, equipment dealers, jewelry from jewelry dealers, mail, which is ISO only, musical instruments, photographic equipment, physician, surgeons, and dentist equipment, signs, theatrical property, and valuable papers and records. All of these are filed classes of marine insurance, primarily because there's a large number of homogeneous insureds, so you don't need to have as much flexibility in coverage provisions. Note that the term non-filed does not mean freedom of rate and form. Standard market inland marine rates are subject to rate regulation. However, rates just don't need to be filed with the state departments of insurance. But if the state determines that the rates are unfair, excessive, or inadequate, they can force the insurer to change the rates as appropriate. Let's look at some general characteristics of inland marine policies. Inland marine policies almost always provide some coverage for property in transit, or at a location away from the insured's premises. The point of inland marine policies, for the most part, is that the property covered under these types of policies is mobile, it is movable, and therefore it needs a certain specialized type of coverage. For some policies, transit coverage is incidental. These are generally called floaters. Examples include contractors' equipment, fine art, jewelry, etc. They're called floaters because covered property can move or float from one location to another. Let's talk about the different valuation provisions available under the inland marine policies. First, there's invoice value and then agreed value. Invoice value is used when the amount of loss can be quickly determined and is not disputed. It covers whatever profit the seller included in the price. when there is a loss to property covered under this policy. Agreed value is when the insured and the insurer agree to the value at policy inception. It's used for property that is more difficult to value objectively, for example, works of art, jewelry, and antiques. This should not be confused with what you know as agreed value in the BPP, which is used to suspend the coinsurance clause, and that's its only purpose. Agreed value here is to make sure that there are fewer or no disputes over the value of property which cannot be easily valued. Now let's look generally at transportation loss exposures. We'll talk about parties involved in transportation, ownership of goods, which can really complicate inland marine types of coverage, and carrier responsibility for loss. So to begin with, parties involved in transportation. There are two different parties primarily involved in transportation. They are the shipper, which is the person or organization shipping goods. Usually it is the seller that has the responsibility for shipping. And then there's the consignee, which is the person that receives property being transported. Usually that's the buyer. Now let's talk about ownership of goods. Generally, the party that owns the goods at the time they are damaged is responsible for, or in other words, suffers the loss. In other words, this is the party that should be purchasing insurance to protect themselves from the loss of damaged goods. The terms of sale usually answers the question of who owned the property at a given time, depending on when the loss occurred. They are free on board vessel or point of origin or destination. It can be any of these three. The buyer or consignee assumes responsibility as soon as goods are placed either aboard the vessel, at the point of origin, or at the destination, with the free on board term of sale. For free on board vessel, for example, the buyer assumes responsibility for loss as soon as the goods are placed aboard the vessel at the port named in the terms, such as FOB vessel, Port of New Orleans. If it's a port of origin or destination, those locations would be specified in the terms of the shipping agreement. FAS, or free alongside vessel, is where the buyer assumes responsibility for loss as soon as the goods are placed next to the vessel at the port, named again in the terms. CIF, or cost insurance freight, is where the seller quotes a price that includes insurance and transportation. Under this term of sale, the buyer assumes responsibility as soon as goods are placed into the custody of the vessel. And then X point of origin. With X point of origin, the buyer takes delivery at the point of origin specified in the terms. So as you can see, with each one of these, the buyer assumes custody and therefore responsibility for property at different times depending on the terms of sale. And the shipper retains responsibility, ownership, or title to property for different time frames depending on the terms of sale as well. Let's now talk about carrier responsibility for loss. Up until now we've been talking about contract carriers, but a carrier could also be a common carrier. Common carriers generally have a higher degree of responsibility than contract carriers. They are generally responsible for damage without regard to negligence, unless it is caused by one of these things: acts of God, such as flood, earthquake, or windstorm; acts of a public enemy; exercise of public authority; inherent vice, which is a destructive condition in the property. For example, it could be that the property was packaged and there was some kind of vermin in the property so that the property was destroyed. The common carrier would not be liable for the damage if that was the case. A bill of lading can limit the cargo carrier's liability. In a so-called released bill of lading, the carrier charges a lower freight rate if in return the shipper agrees to accept a limitation on how much the shipper can recover if the carrier becomes liable for the cargo loss. Now let's look at types of inland marine and ocean cargo policies that are specifically transportation insurance. There's annual transit insurance, open cargo insurance, trip transit insurance, mail insurance, and motor truck cargo insurance. Annual transit insurance is good for an insured that ships frequently. It covers all shipments made throughout the policy period, which is normally a year. The insured must make certain that all modes of transportation to ship its goods over the year are clearly named in the declarations. So, for example, if most of the time the insured ships by truck, but occasionally ships by plane or train, they should make sure that they name train and plane in the declarations of the insurance contract. Usually, this only covers shipments within the continental U.S. and Canada. Mexico can be added for an additional premium. Open cargo insurance. This is an ocean marine contract. In this, the insured is called an assured. The sue and labor clause is a condition of coverage of the open cargo insurance policy. It obligates the insured to preserve property at the time of loss. There are some exclusions known as warranties in open cargo insurance. They are free of capture and seizure, which means that the insurance doesn't cover losses when the vessel is taken by another party. Also, losses related to strikes, riots, and civil commotion are not covered. And there's a delay clause, which says that the insurance doesn't cover losses like spoilage that are caused by a delay in shipping. Then there's trip transit insurance. This covers cargo on a specified trip. It may be ocean marine or inland marine. A trip transit policy is more commonly used to cover property such as a valuable piece of machinery, something that's not as commonly shipped from location to location. Mail insurance protects property in the custody of a mail delivery service, for example, the U.S. Postal Service. It's often cheaper than you can purchase through the government, the USPS. Motor truck cargo insurance protects a carrier's liability from damages or loss of property while in its custody. Motor truck cargo liability insures the liability of a carrier's transporting someone else's property. Finally, let's look at types of inland marine and ocean cargo policies that are not transportation insurance. So, first, equipment floaters, builders and installation risks, bailor policies, dealers policies, and miscellaneous inland marine policies. Under equipment floaters are contractors' equipment. Contractors' equipment is the largest class of commercial inland marine insurance. The equipment used by contractors when constructing buildings, highways, and other structures can be extremely expensive. So such equipment typically cannot be insured under a commercial property policy and must be insured by a contractor's equipment floater. Electronic data processing or computer equipment is another example of equipment floaters. Computer equipment may be insured. Although computer equipment is covered under unscheduled business personal property in the BPP, an inland marine EDP floater can provide added benefits. Many of them cover such perils as mechanical or electrical breakdown, which otherwise can only be covered under an equipment breakdown policy. They also typically insure covered property while in transit, which a BPP would not. Also, the EDP is a non-filed class of inland marine, which provides more flexibility to the insurer and the insured in tailoring the policies to meet the individual coverage needs. Builders and installation risks. We've already covered builders' risks and talked about the fact that they can often be classified as inland marine and are non-filed. Installation risks, which are related to builder's risk. With installation risk coverage, an installation floater is purchased by a contractor or subcontractor to cover property they're installing at job sites. It also might be purchased by the property owner or the seller of property who is responsible for property until installed in the buyer's premises. As we've discussed many times, a bailee is someone who holds property of another for benefit to both parties, for example, laundering, repairing property, and storing property. The bailee-bailor policies covers damage to property without regard to liability. Remember that the bailee is only liable if the bailee is negligent. Types of bailee-bailor policies include warehouse operations legal liability and pattern die floaters. Dealers policies covers inventories and other business personal property of dealers. This includes jewelry dealers, equipment dealers, fine arts, furriers, camera dealers, musical instruments, and stamp and coins dealers. Lastly are a few other miscellaneous inland marine coverages. They are sign coverage and accounts receivable coverage. And that's the end of our discussion of inland marine insurance.